Hello and welcome. This is Amhara Media Corporation and you are watching Messenger. Today on Messenger we are going to talk about Amhara, and to do that I have Professor Shumet Sishagne, a history professor who got his BA from Haile Selassie University in 1973, Master of Arts from Addis Ababa University in 1984, and Doctor of Philosophy or PhD in 1991 from University of Illinois. He has been a lecturer of history in Addis Ababa University and then at Christopher Newport University, Virginia, United States. Professor Shumet has been listed as a noteworthy history professor by Marcus Who's Who and has a book called Unionists and Separatists, the Vagaries of Ethio-Eritrean Relation. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us on Messenger today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are going to talk about Amhara. And to do that, we are going to raise some arguments about it, or we are going to note some scholars and politicians. For instance, Makonnen Mikhail in 2008 said, Amhara identity is claimed to be composed of multiple ethnicities by some, whereas others reject this concept and argue that Amhara exists as a distinctive ethnic group with a specific located boundary. And Gideon P. Cohen in 2000 said that debated about whether the Amhara can legitimately be regarded as an ethnic group given their distribution throughout Ethiopia and the incorporative capacity of the group that led to inclusive of individuals from a wide range of ethnic or linguistic backgrounds. Similarly, Tezera Tazebo said in 1990s was marked by debates both popular and scholarly on the non-existence of Amhara as a distinct ethnic group, giving the debate between the academic Mesfin Waldemariam and the president of the Transitional Government of Ethiopia in July 1991, Meles Zenawi. Historian Brian J. Yates also noted, scholars and politicians have attempted to sketch out what an Amhara is, but there are considerable divergences on the nature of this identity. And finally, ethnographer Donald Levin noted that only in the last quarter of the 20th century has the term Amhara come to be a common ethnic appellation. So saying all these arguments back, let's see Amhara as a people from the perspective of history, civilization, togetherness, and nation building.
All right. Well, serious historians understand that ethnicity essentially is a human construct. It's human beings who essentially create their own identities. So there is nothing fixed about an ethnic identity or our understanding of ourselves. It continues to change, responding to various circumstances. This reminds me of the debate between Prime Minister Meles Zenawi and Professor Mesfin Waldemariam in 1991. Here we have a new regime that essentially was constructed on the basis of ethnic identity. People were required to mobilize themselves around their own specific ethnic identities. And those who didn't have it were required to create it. We know the kind of characters that were brought into the National Assembly in order to realize this ambition of constructing Ethiopia along an ethnic line. Extremely confused and ambiguous identities started to be drawn on the sand, and they started to clarify, and people began really to essentially create a stronger sense of their ethnic identity in order to respond to the changing circumstances, to adjust to the reality that the EPRDF has brought. And Professor Mesfin, as you probably may remember, argued that Amhara have never organized themselves along this line. Their identity essentially has evolved to such a degree that they have a much larger vision and a much larger view of themselves, that they regard themselves as Ethiopians first, and the language that they speak and the culture that they practice essentially has grown around this core value and core idea of being Ethiopian. But Masfin also cautioned at the same time that he had no doubt that Mellas will create an Amhara nationalism that may have been absorbed by Ethiopian nationalism. And I think this was present. It was prophetic because the challenges, the enormous pressure applied against the Amhara for not being ethnically minded, the disadvantages that they suffered eventually has forced people to reassess, re-evaluate, and prioritize their interests and their identities. So, as everywhere in the world, ethnic identities essentially change depending on the circumstances. If you ask who is an Amhara, he who speaks Amharic essentially and identifies with that community is an Amhara. There is nothing that's God-given or created by God. This is an identity, a social construct that human beings create in the course of living and in the course of interacting with each other. The most unique character of what we call the Amhara is its flexibility and its ability to broaden its identity and absorb others.
So can we say Amhara is an expansionist idea or identity as a people?
No, it's an absorbing identity. It is an identity that feels comfortable accepting others and interacting with others.
So it is inclusive.
It's inclusive. It does not wall itself. It does not isolate itself.
So we can say the people of Amhara are not bounded in any kind of location or territorial boundaries.
And that is the mark of a civilization. And that is the reason that Ethiopia has been regarded as unique among most other non-European societies. European imperialists used to say that Africans have no fatherland, that Africans have no history. These were asserted publicly. And the reason that they were saying was that many of these communities in Africa or Asia have such narrow identities that do not transcend linguistic and territorial identities. So many of these communities have failed to evolve a structure and institutions that cross over and bind various groups together. That's where strength comes, and that is where civilization comes, and that's where the capacity to defend oneself against enemies comes. The Ethiopian identity, largely created with the Amhara playing the core role, was able to transcend those sectarian and narrow identities, and in creating an Ethiopia that was strong enough to defend itself and to write its own history. Europeans have said that Africans have no history. Ethiopians have a history largely because they were able to create their own history, to write their own history. They were able to do this because many of the ethnic groups were able to shed their parochial identity and merge into a larger and a more evolved society and political institution. And the Amhara have played an important role in making this happen.
But some scholars argued that the people of Amhara, or the idea of being an Amhara, emerged in the 20th century. And some people believe that Amharas don't exist before the 20th century. What do you say about it?
Well, they wouldn't have just dropped from the sky in the 20th century, for sure. And Ethiopia is fortunate in this. We are one of the very few literate communities who have our own system of writing. So we have Ge'ez and Amharic manuscripts. Our histories are recorded. We have chronicles and so on. So we know very well that for a very long time we have people that spoke Amharic, cultural entities that resided in areas where they resided, of course, depends on the demography and the increase in population and the political interactions and the economic integrations. So, but we know for sure. So, I mean, essentially, these are largely new constructs that were created in order to legitimize Ethiopian statehood. So much of what you see today in the 20th and 21st century is largely a repeat of what the Europeans have already said at the end of the 19th century. Those Europeans have ambitions on Ethiopia, and in order to capture Ethiopia, they will have to deny the existence of Ethiopia and of Ethiopianism, and they would have to denigrate the communities that they thought were upholding this idea of Ethiopianism. So the Amhara was largely targeted because the Europeans thought that the Amhara were the center of the Ethiopian state, and if they could force that center to crumble, they will be able to get a weak Ethiopia that would fall prey to imperialism, just like most other parts of Asia and Africa. So what we see today is really kind of a plagiarized version of what the Europeans have concocted at the end of the 19th century.
The single establishment of Beta Amhara around the 13th century, which consists of Gondar, Gojam, Wallo, Lasta, Shawa, Angote, Samen, and Fatagar, is like a nice evidence that Amharas existed before the 20th century.
For that community to play that kind of political role in the 13th and 14th century and succeeding centuries, that indicates that there was already a reservoir there, a fairly well-developed community.
Now let's see the contribution of the people of Amhara in Ethiopian nation building. What did the people of Amhara as an ethnic group or as a people do to contribute for the nation building of Ethiopia?
Well, again, when we think of Ethiopia, we should not imagine really an Ethiopia of the Amhara. The capacity of the Amhara, the greatest contribution of the Amhara was its ability to work with others, to team up with others, to break its own isolation, to remove barriers, obstacles to nation building. So if we attribute any contributions, specific contributions to Amhara, it is its capacity to work with others.
Can we get an example for that?
Oh, Ethiopia is a very example. The medieval Ethiopian state that emerged in the 13th century, the great civilization that ensued as a result, and Ethiopia's evolution into a multi-ethnic state with strong structures and institutions, a shared value of upholding Ethiopianism. All of that is really a significant contribution that enabled various groups to come together, to hold hands and essentially create an Ethiopian entity that was much bigger than any of the ethnic groups that supported it. There is a work that has been admired recently. This is a book called Sapiens, the Story of Humankind by Hariri, an Israeli historian. And he said, human beings are different from other animals largely because they are able to work together. 1,000 monkeys will create havoc and disaster. 1,000 human beings coming together creates civilization. Human strength and the quality of their achievements depends on their ability to work and cooperate with each other. The Amhara has essentially succeeded in bypassing its parochial limitations and creating an atmosphere that was conducive for interaction and for various and diverse groups together. Its ability to entertain diversity and to be able to work with others.
The inclusiveness and shared values. Since we are talking about values,
right,
what could be other values of Amhara as a people?
Well, I mean, its ability to essentially work towards an enlightened self-interest, It's the ability to not limit its interest to very specific geographies or very specific cultural entities. Its capacity to transcend.
But they call the transcendence an oppression or expansion.
Well,
because Amharas are not bounded in any kind of boundaries. They say it is expansionist, it is oppressive, it wanted to impose its identity, its language, and its way of life on others.
No, well, yeah, I know how this narrative has developed, and that narrative was largely the work of those who wanted to deconstruct. So when you want to destroy, to create a new identity, you will have to destroy the old one. Much of the narrative that you see today about the Amhara is largely designed with the purpose of deconstruction. The Amhara is not only interested in moving out, but in allowing others to move in as well. The Amhara value is a value of sharing and of exchange, of interaction. It's not a one-side or a one-lane traffic. It goes both ways. The Amhara contribution has managed to continue over the centuries, largely because it is not one direction. It gives and it receives. It kind of synthesizes the diverse views and the diverse interests. It is capable of interacting with others, not just to impose its own will or value on others, but to create a synthesis that's taken from everyone. And that is where great civilizations are built, and that is how strong institutions are established.
Of course, civilization needs a holistic approach, you know, like they have to be included everybody. But the one which is misunderstood now is the Amharas, moving to different places, living in different places, and have shared values. They say they are everywhere. The Amhara people are everywhere because they are expansionists, because they are oppressors, and they wanted to impose their way of life everywhere. And they wanted to rule and lead everyone. So that's why we are talking about Amhara now. So the intention of the Amhara people when they move to other places and include everyone else, or like be open to new experiences, new meeting and civilization, is misunderstood, I think. So what could be the intention of the Amhara people in our sense, in history? What was the intention?
Or even this moving, in quotation, has also to be critically examined. Have this community moved to places that it didn't know or it did not belong to? We have to essentially really look into the demographic patterns in the country. If you find an Amhara in Wolaga or in Shoa, you would have found an Amhara in the 12th and 13th and 14th and 15th and 16th century. The churches that you see today in many of the south and southwestern parts of Ethiopia in medieval periods are an indication of how far and how wide the population movement is and the patterns of settlements were in Ethiopia. People move. We know in record time how far and how wide various linguistic groups have moved in Ethiopia. So we should not be surprised if we see Amharic speakers living here or there in the same way that the Oromo speaking or other language groups have also spread far and wide. There are demographic pressures. There are environmental factors that force populations to move, especially pastoral communities that have moved far and wide. So the presence of Amharic speaking or other language groups living here or there is not just explained by a certain group moving. This was characteristic of most population groups in Ethiopia. Sometimes whole language groups are displaced by massive population movements, and anyone who is familiar with the medieval the history of Ethiopia and with what happened in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century with regard to population movements would see the picture of how this has functioned and worked in Ethiopia. So it's false to assume that the Amhara are where they don't belong, because we know the population pattern, settlement patterns were relatively different back then.
Yeah, first of all, moving is a characteristic of any human beings. So they just wanted to give it to Amhara for other political agendas. So we can say the intention of the Amhara people in unifying Ethiopia or wanting to see the united Ethiopia is genuine. It's just for society's betterment.
No doubt about it. The elite in those days discovered that more can be gained through competition and through cooperation rather than competition. That it was useful to try to develop structures and institutions that others are willing to embrace. That it was necessary to essentially share, essentially give and take. That's the kind of price that you pay. It's not enough to want to do something. You have to persuade others or provide incentives for others and to work with you. And so the polity, the elite group that succeeds to develop the mechanism by which others can work with you succeeds in building a much larger and more effective organization, and that's what we call the state.
So when we are talking about unity, unification, and we have the ethnic federalism, which has been pressuring all the people of Ethiopia, all the ethnic group of Ethiopia to be nationalist. So let's talk about the Amhara nationalism.
Well, remember how we started this discussion. I have said that identity is a human construct. This is what human beings have created. It changes according to their specific challenges, the circumstances that essentially pressurizes communities to move in whatever direction. I don't know what direction the Amhara identity is going to take, because it's going to depend on the kind of challenges that the Amhara are going to face, and on the character of the elite that's going to preside over this conversation and essentially chart the course that this identity is going to follow. What I know for sure is that this project of building an Ethiopia that responds to the needs and interests of the many is much preferable to ethnic identity or ethnic projects. Let's be mindful of the characters that are now pushing toward this ethnic, politicized ethnic identity. These are characters that for sure want to use this issue in order to promote and advance themselves. It's not really for the interest of their communities. These are people who cannot gainfully be employed in any of the professions. They have commercialized politics. They have transformed ethnic politics into a business. It is used to promote the self. It's used to create a class that can never enrich itself unless it peddles ethnic identity and ethnicized politics. I don't think any sane person wants us to revert back to those ancient and brutal times.
I think we are already back to the ancient time, but like to be critical on this, isn't it bizarre when you have ethnic federalism and you want it to be an Ethiopian? Because the critics of the Amhara people still now in the current political situation is wanting to be an Ethiopian when there is ethnic federalism and everybody is organized on their ethnic basis.
That's the argument that advocates of of ethnic strengthening or fortifying the ethnic group in order to defend itself from an imminent danger. And we see that danger.
Of course.
And it will be futile to advise people not to defend themselves, not to prepare themselves. However, we must also remember the end game in this kind of situations. When you have ethnic groups that are now being actively sponsored to retrench, to strengthen themselves, essentially they are strengthening themselves against the others. So what we are going to have is a scenario in which one prepares against the other. It's only the devil that should advise this. Unfortunately, in Ethiopia, organized political parties are engaged in creating this very risky game. They are gambling, and they think they will win. I know for sure that they want to win, but I also realize that they may bring everyone down with them.
Don't you think the Amhara people are losing a lot?
There is no doubt. They are losing a lot, and unfortunately, the state that is established in order to make sure that these things do not happen, that's the only purpose of the state. We create the state so that it can be above and beyond us, so that it can have a bird's eye view of the condition in society and ensure that peace and order is maintained, that it monopolizes violence and the tools of violence, and ensures that individuals and groups do not engage in these kinds of activities that will disrupt the civic cohesion. What's happening in our country at present is the arm of the state, either out of inefficiency and weakness, or I wouldn't say out of deliberate plan. I don't think anyone that's burdened with this responsibility of ruling over Ethiopia would engage in this crime. But whatever the motives, the risk is equally grave, whether they do it on purpose or out of ignorance or out of weakness. They are exposing the Ethiopians, regardless of their ethnic identity, to grave consequences, to total disruption, and to the possibility of disintegration. Human beings live well when they are in an atmosphere of peace and security, and that is a function of the state, ensure stability. The state at the moment is failing left and right to uphold the law. We have to really be forced to respect the law. We see killings everywhere. We see displacements everywhere. We see certain population groups being targeted. And we see the state essentially abdicating its responsibility of protecting these people. But this should not essentially lead us towards aggravating the by resorting to actions that do not help mend the circumstance. It requires very, very careful handling of the situation. And anyone who is angered by what is happening to the Amhara at the moment, and they should be angered. It's right. It's right and it's proper to struggle to stop this. But at the same time, they must also think of how do we resolve this situation in the long term, not just reacting to what we feel now, but reacting in such a way that we do not experience these things indefinitely, that there is kind of a workable and permanent solution, that our action should be characterized by careful thinking and a very careful organization that ensures success and not just the demise of the state.
That's why we're talking about history today, right? and the contribution of the Amhara people and other people of Ethiopia to the united Ethiopia. We can refer the Zaman Mesafint and how we become united after that, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we keep talking about history and the people's contribution to the betterment of the people. But we keep talking about Amhara because they are the only people who have been targeted as an ethnic identity. If you see the Oromo the people dying in Oromia, they're Amharas. If you see who TPLF is targeting, they're Amhara and Afar too. So like the Amhara people are targeted because of their ethnic identity. They didn't even claim to be an Amhara, right? They think they're Ethiopians. So why are people targeting Amhara when it doesn't even think as an ethnic group or an ethnic identity in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I don't think the Amhara are going to be the only targets of this carnage. The problem is it's not going to stop with the Amhara. You see large numbers of Amhara communities now being targeted in Wolaga, for example.
Of course.
Mark my word, this carnage is not going to stop with the Amhara. Once that group is eliminated or removed from that scene, it will be the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. Once you cannot play with this kind of fire. It ends up in consuming almost everyone.
So it is
and
just
that is why governments should be very careful about how they handle this situation. It may look like the Amhara are the only ones that are targeted today, but it's not going to stop there. So any person or group or ruling class that tries to preside over Ethiopia would have to understand that unless the state intervenes and puts an end to this in the initial stage, eventually it will be everyone against everyone. And that's why we should worry today. It's not just an Amhara problem. It has become an Ethiopian problem. Let's not forget how many thousands of Oromo have been killed about 5-6 years ago in that conflict with Somalia, etc. And large numbers of ethnic groups are being killed by other ethnic groups in the south and several parts of the country. The Amhara may be a large group, so it may have attracted more attention, but the killing is going almost everywhere. And those who now initiate the killing, or those who tolerate the killing, will themselves now be the next target of that killing. This is not something that has a fixed boundary. It's a moving target, and it will keep on moving until it has affected almost everyone. That is why we have to pay very serious attention. Re-establishment of the state apparatus as an instrument for maintaining law and order has to be re-established. It's not enough to try to convince people through rhetoric that the situation will improve itself. We have waited for more than 3 years for the situation to improve. We have actually become apologists of this laziness, but things seem to grow worse. It's time that the state wakes up from its sleep and realize that there isn't much to hold unless they start right now, before everything really slips away from their hands. The Ethiopian people have really hoped so much from the recent change, but they're also losing hope. They are disillusioned. And a government that does not pay attention to these changing perceptions and changing attitudes really is endangering itself and, of course, the country, unfortunately. And the only advantage that you have a government is to ensure that this is a society of laws, that the law works, that we don't descend into animals. In some areas, really, the situation had deteriorated to such a degree that it's now very difficult to separate the humans from animals, the way they behave towards each other, the brutality and the cruelty. And it is a function of the state to make sure that this does not happen, to ensure that the devices that the state has, the instruments that the state has, are not blunted by laziness, by ineffectiveness, and by inefficiency. The arms of the state should be strengthened. It should be very clear about its objectives, and it should be impartial about the application of the law. Everyone has to place themselves under the law. That is the function of the state. If force has to be used, it should not be used by individuals and groups, but by the state, which should essentially exercise that power in its hands to ensure that individuals do not feel betrayed, that groups do not feel abandoned.
Unfortunately, the state of Ethiopia is failing Ethiopians, and we hope it's going to be better this time.
Yes, I'm hoping that there is still time, but the deceptions have to stop. We should stop fooling each other. Groups have to stop that they will be the ultimate victors of this gambling, or kumar as they call it. In the end, every gambler ends up losing. You profit from gambling when other people are not aware of your tricks. Once they discover the tricks, it doesn't work for you. In the end, everyone loses. Above all, those that are holding state power should realize that they have a huge burden on them. They should not try to remain in power through words that do not translate into actions, by deceptive methods, and by promises that are not realized. In the end, when everyone becomes aware of these deceptions, there is nothing left for the state to hold. When the majority of your people realize that you are not up to your promise, that whole charade is opened. So anyone that is entrusted with that kind of power must understand that power must be exercised with wisdom and effectively as well. There is nothing more important than security for any human being. And people are feeling so insecure. And it's very difficult to achieve much in an atmosphere of insecurity. Suspicions, conspiracies, all those abound when the state fails in its primary function of upholding the law with an impartial hand.
Gambling could be fun when you do it with money, with properties, but it is not fun. It is not interesting when you do it with people's life.
Yeah.
And the politicians should understand that they are gambling with people's life, and when they lose, people are dying and people are displaced, so they should know and stop playing with the Ethiopian people and start working.
It is true. I mean, I can't get enough words to describe my disgust with the way that some politicians in this country are expressing themselves. We used to pride ourselves with a highly sophisticated culture and a very gentle character.
Which demands integrity.
It demands integrity, it demands honesty, and it demands the capacity to see how low you are when you utter these words and engage in these kinds of politics. We have now lost shape, and many of our prominent officials are not even ashamed of the words that they have uttered and of the utter destruction that these words have caused on the ground.
So I think the basis of a politician is understanding the reality, right?
It's not only understanding the reality, it's also the capacity to reflect and look at oneself.
I think they are looking at the illusion they have been creating.
Well, because they have developed such a perception that essentially has abandoned any sense of shame. The great value that Ethiopians used to have, that value that forced most of us to aspire for higher and more decent goals, is this sense of shame, being ashamed of being caught or of not performing up to expectation. When you lose shame, you essentially lose the most important and the most productive human value. It is shame that inhibits us from engaging in overkill. It is shame that essentially leads us or pushes us towards achieving more and better. Shame of being perceived as bad, as deceptive, as weak. Those are noble ideas that essentially allow human beings and push human beings to do their best. That brings the best out of them. That is being lost now. And people are priding themselves for the tricks that they have committed on the people, for the deceptive policies that they have pursued, and for that supposed gain that they are going to get out of these deceptions.
That could only work if you are a gambler and a con artist.
It is true.
Right? If you are a politician, you don't need tricks. You just need a desire to do better for your people.
Yeah, it's this idea of your people. The problem with us now is we have stopped at looking at our people as our people.
Oh.
They have compartmentalized the Ethiopian people. So it's someone who has about 10% of the Ethiopian people would care less for the other 90% of people. They are not him. They are the other. And the other can be subjected to all kinds of tortures and brutality and cruelty. This is the basic problem that comes with ethnicized politics. You stop to see others as yours. You have othered them. They have become different. They are not yours.
They just become statistics.
Yes.
Numbers.
You don't like them. Their suffering doesn't mean much to you. They have stopped becoming part of you. They're not your flesh and blood. And this is what ethnicity brings with it.